now you have your patient in your office, you have their data in front of you. What is your approach to going through that data, and how do you explain this when you're talking with your patient?
Yeah, no, it's a good thought. And it's all about shared decision making when you're working with a patient. Thinking about the data, take a look at it beforehand so you have a sense in your mind of what you're looking at is really, really helpful. What I try to do is download the Ambulatory Glucose Profile, the AGP, because it's a one-page summary. It works very well in clinic settings. And what we like to think about is a mnemonic. We all love mnemonics. So determine where to act. And if you look at an ambulatory glucose profile, it's divided into 3 sections. The top third is glucose metrics. The middle part is a modal day view. It's the ambulatory glucose profile graph. That gives you sort of a summary view of patterns presented on a 24-hour graph, so you can see where do you tend to be high during the day, where do you tend to be low during the day. The bottom third is little thumbnail views of daily glucose profiles, so you can see if there's a bad day, that tends to be visible. And so you've got the 3 sections. What we like to do, determine where to act. The first part is determine. So we want to look at the top third of the ambulatory glucose profile report, determine if action is needed. How do you do that? Time and ranges. So if you look over on the right-hand side of an ambulatory glucose profile, there's a thermometer graph, right? And there's green, red, yellow. Green for time in range. Red is the time below range, which is time spent with a glucose less than 70. And the top part, the yellow part, is the time above range. And so just in 10 seconds, what I do is I take a look at this top portion, the metrics. Is the time in range at goal? Is the time below range too high? And so what's that goal? Time in range, that's time with a glucose between 70 and 180 milligrams per deciliter. You want that to be over 70% of your day. And why 70% of the day? Because very loosely that correlates with an A1C around 7%. And so 70% time in range, you want to get above that if you can. How about hypoglycemia? So time below range, what we try to work towards is less than 4% of the time with a time below 70. And so minimize the time in hypoglycemia, obviously. You might say, well, don't we want the time below range to be 0? And, we sort of do in real terms. If you look at a glucose profile for somebody with no diabetes, a normal glycemic response, you see time below 70. So that's maybe 1.1% of the time if you look at a population-based study. And so people can drop below 70. It's not dangerous. We worry about it in diabetes because if you're treating people with agents that can cause hypoglycemia, which is insulin, sulfonylurea therapy, you want to minimize it because we worry that you're going to drop further than 70, right? So 4% is the threshold. You want to be under 4%. The reason it's not 0% is A, in the real world, people drift below 70 all the time. And B, if you have type 1 diabetes, you're fairly sensitive to insulin. It's hard to get a time in range of 70% without accepting a little bit of drift below 70. And so less than 4% time below range. So what I do is in 5 or 10 seconds, I look at the stacked bar graph, the thermometer graph. Is the time in range above 70%? If it is, we're in a good range as far as normal glucose. Is the time below range less than 4%? If it's 4% or more, we've got too much hypoglycemia. And we always want to deal with hypoglycemia first. That's your short-term safety risk. And so 5 or 10 seconds, look at your time and ranges, determine if you need to take action. Once you've decided if you need to take action, you go down to the middle and bottom part and determine where action is needed. We're looking at patterns. There's a median line. There's margins, the 95 and 5% line. And we're seeing if there's a pattern to hypoglycemia, if there's a pattern to hyperglycemia, because those are targets for intervention. If we're using insulin-based therapy, for instance, we want to see if we're dropping excessively overnight. Maybe we've got too much basal insulin on board. We want to see if we're having a daytime rise for undertreating mealtime glucose. And so we want to determine where we need to take the action, especially if we're dealing with insulin. If we're dealing with non-insulin therapies, a lot of times you're painting with a broader brush. And you're not quite as focused in where you're taking your intervention, but for insulin, we certainly are. And then we want to take a look at the daily views and just see if what we're seeing on the average view is that outlying data. Is it a pattern of hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia, or is it an artifact? You know, you do get artifacts sometimes. You're sleeping on a sensor, you're sleeping on your arm. That pressure can sometimes be enough to cause the glucose usually to drift down because you're forcing all the interstitial fluid out from around the sensor, so it's not reading accurately. So compression artifact at night especially. And you can usually pick that up if you're looking at those daily views. And it's an artifact, it's not a pattern, don't need to act on that. And so the last thing, determine where to act, is we want to act on the data. So we don't just want to interpret the data, talk about the data. Work with the person in clinic with you to figure out what your action step is. Is it adjusting diet? Is it adjusting lifestyle? Or is it adjusting insulin? Is it adding a GLP-1, doing something to improve the glucose patterns you see in?